Hey everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. Meat Eater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the Engineer's going to be there. Meat Eater Live headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay? Every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Arts Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.
Oh, hey there, and welcome to another podcast out of Bozeman, Montana called The Hunting Collective. This is episode 89. This episode, I believe, is an important one. It's one that's probably a little more perilous than some of the others we've done. It might be a topic that turns some people off, but hey, that's us, right, Phil? We're those guys.
It's important.
Yeah, I've dragged you along kicking and screaming on this ride that is The Hunting Collective. We're going to be talking about race and hunting, specifically things like privilege, things like cultural competency, a lot around the history of the outdoors, our institutions, our idols, and conservation, and whether that was inclusive of African Americans. And we're going to do that with Dr. Carolyn Finney, author of a book called Black Faces and White Spaces. Is it Spaces?
Spaces.
Got it. She's awesome, and I really enjoyed talking to her. She's full of life, full of laughter, a great person to kind of address what can be a tough topic, or a topic that we don't talk about all that much. So I'm glad to have her on. And prior to that, we had one of my favorite folks in the world, in the meat eater world, specifically Miles Nolte, our director of fishing, but really a thoughtful dude and somebody I would go to for his opinion on almost anything in life. He's got a lot to add to any conversation. All right, enjoy episode 89.
I guess I grew up on an older road, a pedal to the metal, always did what I was told. Until I found out that my brand new clothes came secondhand from the rich kids next door. When I grew up fast, I guess I grew up mean. There's 1,000 things inside my head I wish I ain't seen. And now I just wander through a real bad dream, or feeling like I'm coming apart at the seams. But thank you, Jack Daniels, oh, number 7.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Hunting Collective, episode 89. We got a lot to get to. Miles Nolte's here. Hey, Miles.
I'm here.
You don't really know what we're going to talk about, do you?
I actually have no idea why I'm here.
Yeah.
Other than you asked me to be here, so I walked in.
Yeah, and so I do. It is a very important subject. One that I know you're versed on, so I'm not worried about it.
That's good. I mean, this is actually my first day back from vacation, so I'm like,
oh yeah,
I'm feeling good.
You're like in.
I'm pretty mellow right now.
Yeah, me too. We're on like a podcast binging experience, and I just got done interviewing Carolyn Finney, who wrote a book called Black Faces, White Places, White Spaces.
White Spaces, yeah.
Is the correct title. And it's the reimagining the place of the African American in the outdoors. It's cool. It was a good conversation. There's a lot of things that came up that I think we can talk through here. It was one of those conversations where I found her to be awesome. I found the conversation to be enlightening. When I was like driving home, I was thinking of all the things I wish I had said, had asked.
Like you do.
Actually, you tend to do when these things come up. So I think we'll just go ahead and, with apologies to Carolyn for not talking about them during the interview, try to bring them up here, set the stage a little bit for what we're about to talk about there. And in the interview, I very much admitted to being nervous about the conversation for many, many reasons. One, because it's a conversation that's kind of like, it's just perilous. Like that we can step in a lot of things here, but like we got to be able to have it, and we got to be able to have it in a constructive way.
Well, anytime we talk about race in our culture, it feels perilous generally.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. There's a whole lot of bad shit tied up in our historical and contemporary racial relationships, and a lot of people get spun up on their perspectives about that and very, very defensive to the point where, as you're saying, constructive conversations can become very difficult.
Yeah, we're just coming off a podcast about regenerative agriculture, and now we're diving right into some real social justice type topics. So it's going to take me a while to dig out of this progressive liberal hole that I'm digging myself into. I'm going to have a couple of NRA lobbyists on, probably go to a NASCAR race. Something like that to really even it out.
If you go to the NASCAR race, you have to paint your shirtless self with the Confederate flag if you really want to get out of
this hole. Is Jeff Gordon still good? Because he's my favorite.
If you're asking me, you're asking the wrong person.
Phil, you're a fan.
Yeah. How did you know?
Nah, I just made it up. Jeff Gordon was great, but that's the last time I was really into it.
Number 24.
Number 24. He used to the DuPont Chevy. He was a DuPont Chevy. Anyway.
Sure.
Kyle Busch? That seems right.
Yes.
That seems like a guy.
That's a guy. Tony Stewart.
Hey, we're saying names now.
Orange shirt.
Both Dale Earnhardts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Junior and senior.
Uh-huh.
There's probably another dude. There's another dude named Kerry Earnhardt. Look at me pulling that out of nowhere. I think I just had a small stroke. So we got to get into this, like this conversation, right? You think a lot about race, and it's very important. Like it's something that we have to address, both from a hunting community side of things, where we know that 2% of our of the hunting community is African American, 13% of the nation is African American. These are things that we know. But beyond that kind of like very tangible look at the numbers, there's just wanting to be inclusive, wanting to go to the thing that we love so much, and wanting to do it in any possible way that we can, right? So it doesn't matter if it's whatever minority, whatever part of the country, whether it's urban or rural, or white or black, we want people to understand it and come into it in the best way that they can. And so for me, this is just one step in that journey. And it's specifically focusing on one group of people that has been marginalized and has a history in this country that's not so pretty. And the outdoors is all entangled in that history, as you'll hear coming up. I mean, you'll hear Carolyn Finney talking about how John Muir is a conservation hero and a hero in the environmentalist movement, but also a big-time racist and a big-time very prejudiced, and it's in his writings. It's laid bare in what he writes. So when we celebrate guys like that,
Teddy wasn't exactly a bastion of diversity either.
Yeah, he was a mixed up character in a lot of ways.
Yeah, he wasn't a huge fan of brown people.
Yeah, no, not at all. And so here we are with this, like, we have built these folks up, and for what they've done, we see them for what they've done for our lives positively. But then there's also this mixed history that Carolyn focuses on and wants to focus on because it's a part of her history. And so there's some convenient parts where we ignore it or don't talk about it, but that I think is just natural because it's hard. It's hard for us to come to grips with that a little bit.
I think so. And the piece that I'm sure you got into with Carolyn that I think is important, right? We're going to talk about it in a hunting and fishing perspective in terms of this creating or how we think about being inclusive for the folks that we speak to. But if you look at the outdoor recreational community in general, I don't know how much time you spend in REI.
Oh yeah.
But the last time I was in REI, I wasn't thinking, you know what? This is a cultural melting pot. I feel like I'm in New Orleans right now. Yeah. That is not my experience when I'm in REI.
White people in puffy jackets.
Exactly. Like there are a lot of affluent, well-to-do, well-meaning white people in here. And that's nothing to say against well-meaning white people.
Yeah. I mean, like she did, a really good job of setting up some of these things, and I admit to having angst around how we talk about this and the way that and to not be reductive about REI is the way it is, not because there's a bunch of racist people that own it.
No.
It is because it's like a part of our culture that has gone that way. And Carolyn talks about, and something that really struck me as effective is cultural competency, like understanding, being competent and both articulate about where we come from, how we got here, and then that's a better way to acknowledge someone coming into a situation going, I don't feel comfortable or welcome in this thing you created. And what you'll hear me tell her right off the bat is like, you know what? When I read your book, I'm looking around, reading some other things. I feel like I just want to tell you that it sucks that other people don't feel comfortable in a place that has done so much for me. Like, it sucks, right? That's not great. It
sucks, but it's also understandable.
Yeah, it's understandable. It sucks. Let's do something about it. That's where I come from. I don't have any feeling like I want to play to one hand or the other. I just want to make sure we've had this conversation and we understand it's an issue for very, very good reasons, but we ignore a lot of this conversation.
Well, it's much more comfortable to stay within your own space with people who look like you and sound like you and you have a shared cultural background and experience with. You have a shared knowledge base, right? You don't have to work hard. When you and I get together, right, in case people listening don't know, I am also a white man.
Yes.
Just in case that wasn't immediately obvious.
He's got a beard as well.
I am bearded. I have my Bozeman camouflage on all the time.
Yeah.
But when you and I sit down, there is a baseline of expected knowledge that we have that we don't have to recreate, both in the way that we speak and the experiences that we share, that other people coming into this room would not have, right? And so there's a comfort there. So I think the point is not that there is some grand conspiracy to make outdoor recreation, particularly hunting and fishing, a uniquely white activity. I don't think that's generally true. I don't think that's true at all, really. But I think there's a need to recognize that whether it's intentional or not, that's the experience of someone coming in from the outside.
Yeah.
Like, I don't go sit down at a mahjong table in Chinatown and feel immediately comfortable.
Yeah.
I have no touch point for what the hell's going on there. And it might be that mahjong is an amazing game that gives people all kinds of insight into their life and things that I don't have in my own world. And if I could get into that community, I would experience those benefits too. But I don't have that. That's the sort of corollary we have to recognize in terms of welcoming people in and saying, like, hey, these are things that may not feel immediately comfortable to you. This is a space that may not be something you understand or have any contacts with. We think it's valuable.
Oh, yeah.
You might want to check it out. It's not, and if this argument comes down to like, well, it's not a conspiracy and they're welcome anytime we want, I'm not intentionally excluding anyone, that doesn't get us anywhere.
Yeah, that's where I'm at, right? So you could be, a little reductive or about this and say, like, I don't, what am I going to do? If they want to, like, public lands is a good example. If they want to come to public lands, they're more than welcome there. Like, that's the great equalizer. Everybody can go and step on those things. You could say all that, and I've said it in the past, but, like, it doesn't do anybody any good. Mm-mm. It's a disservice to write this type of thing off. And when you hear Carolyn talk, you'll quickly come to realize there's a lot of baggage here, cultural baggage that comes along with all our institutions, all our legislation, all of our leaders that we so idolize. Like, all these things have baggage, and why not? Why wouldn't you, as an intellectual, well-meaning person, want to acknowledge that baggage and figure out how to get over it? And not, I think sometimes there's some shallow, also well-meaning folks in the hunting industry that just like, oh, a black hunter, put them up. Like, here they are.
The tokenism?
Yeah. We talk about that too in the interviews. Like, we put them up. Oh my God, they're here. Like, that's one way to go. That's fine. But at the same time, like, we should be able to meet them where they are and say, hey, look, I get it. I understand there's some angst here that we need to address. There's a lot of me that just doesn't, I don't know your perspective, so I can't really help, but let me listen to you and let me figure it out with you. Like, I think that's maybe reaching across the aisle that exists.
There's a difference between being allowed to be somewhere and being welcome somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think that's the ultimately the conversation topic we're having right now. And I've talked to a lot of folks who disagree with me, who say, well, just having that allowance gets me off the hook. I have no more responsibility here other than to say, like, you can do this. I'm not stopping you. And I take it to a different level and say, no, there's a responsibility to understand cultural and historical context, which sounds like you dive into significantly.
That's the best thing that comes out of this, in my opinion.
And that because of that context, I feel more of a responsibility. I feel a responsibility to do more than just say you're allowed. I feel a responsibility to say, no, you're welcome. And I would like to find ways to make this a more comfortable place for you to step into if that's something you're interested in doing.
Yeah, and this is something that came up, and I wish I do regret not really diving into this in more detail with Carolyn, but we can certainly discuss it here. There's an idea that she brings up, and another writer that she is friends with named Jonathan Hall, who you'll find was on Anthony Bourdain's show and wrote an article, Hunting While Black. He's pretty direct in saying, like, I'm not comfortable and going on public lands. And it's because there's white people with guns there.
Totally.
And so as I think about that, I'm like, okay, this whole podcast, this conversation is partly just understanding that feeling, or trying to get a good understanding of that feeling. I said, listen, I grew up in Maryland. When I went to Baltimore to attend a sporting event or something, and we went a couple of blocks west of where we probably should have been, I felt very uncomfortable. I felt like I was in danger. But there's a point in that logic where it falls apart for me, where it's like, how are you going to go through life attaching? Is it the same thing to say, like, if I see a bunch of black guys on the corner in West Baltimore, that I'm assuming what they're up to? If you see a bunch of white hunters walking around in deer camp in the middle of Colorado, you're assuming that there might be inherent danger there, or there might be some inherent bias there. Like, it's a tough way to walk around in the world. And that, like, you're carrying the baggage around with you in a way that just, it has to shape your own interactions and your own perceptions of how people treat you. And so that's one thing that I was thinking about last night after we recorded with Carolyn, and I wish I may email her about this just because I think it's important. And she would have a great answer to it. So I'm sorry to everybody listening that we didn't do this, but we touched on around it. But that's something I was thinking about. I'm like, I don't want to write off the fact that Jonathan Hall and Carolyn Finney feel very uncomfortable walking around in public lands. I think Jonathan Hall wrote that he feels like he would have to wear triple orange. And Carolyn told a story like she just didn't want to go.
Right.
And so I get that, but at what point are you kind of manifesting the thing you don't want?
Oh man, I don't know. I think I'm certainly not going to I can't speak for anyone else's experience, and I certainly can't speak for the experience of being a black person going hunting. I can't. So, I mean, I think the best I could do in this situation as we're having this conversation is to say, like, the only time in my life when I lived in a city was when I went to college, and I lived in Los Angeles, and I made a bunch of different friends, a lot of different backgrounds, some of whom I'm still in very good contact with. And when I invite friends of mine who are black, who still live in LA, to come out to Montana and go hunting with me, the response I always get is, I'm really not comfortable running around in the woods of Montana with where there's going to be a bunch of white dudes with guns. Yep. And I hear your point, but I also think that, like, I'm not going to try and convince them, like, no, your reality's wrong. And that's everybody here is super cool and won't shoot you.
That's why it's even like pisses me off that I didn't get to say that to Carolyn. But I do feel that there's some element of that present. Like, you're not going to go to someone and be like, get over it. Because once you hear Carolyn speak, or some intelligent African Americans speak about kind of their feelings around race and the outdoors and culture, you'll very quickly come to realize, like, this shit's real, and if you write it off, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
Like, but there's also, like, some things that can be improved on that side of the coin to say, like, okay, like, don't generalize all 2019 white hunters in the way that you wouldn't want me to generalize all people on the other side. Whether the generalization is warranted through, like, millennia of fucked up occurrences between our races, like, it's hard to continue to walk through the world like that, I would think, right? And, like, it's really wearing that baggage in a way that is troublesome. I want to help with a solution there. I'm not calling them out in any way, but it's just something I was thinking of.
But here's the thing, right? Like, and let's set aside any issues of getting shot, because I think that's a little hyperbolic. I don't actually think that people in the woods, no matter how racist they are, can be like, there's a black dude, shoot him and call it an accident. I don't see that as a reality. But what I do see as a reality is, let's be frank, let's be straight up about it. If you brought a friend who was not white into hunting camp, there would be double takes if people hadn't been prepared for that, right? And what that means, what I mean by that is, that person would immediately recognize that they were in a place where they were the odd person out, and they didn't immediately feel like they fit into there. And that's a hard thing to do, right? Because you have to be the interloper. You have to be the first person to come across the line. It's to build off of your analogy, it would kind of be like you walking into West Baltimore. Probably nothing bad's going to happen to you, but there might be a bunch of people who are just kind of like, why are you here, dude?
What the fuck are you doing? Yeah.
Why are you here? This isn't your space. Why? And that's an uncomfortable place to be. And you have to have good reason and a lot of sort of internal fortitude and self-confidence to stay in that space when there are a lot of people looking at you wondering, why the hell is he here?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's easy. In many of these conversations, like, we can fall into the trap of talking about wanting diversity or talking about wanting more hunters, but then falling short of actually like reaching across that aisle that exists and saying, hey, let's deal with this the way you want to deal with it instead of me dealing with this issue in the way that I want to and telling you what you should do to come be a part of this. Like, what do you want us to do? Because we care, man. Like, I care. Yeah. I think a lot of hunters care. And it's never just going to happen on its own. It's quite obvious. There's too many barriers of economic and cultural and social things that if they're not going to fall over on their own, we got to kick them over. Like, that's just how it is. You like that one?
I don't know if that's the analogy I would personally run with, but I'll let you go.
Whatever. I mean, we have to address them. Like, we have to address those things head on. Hey, come up with a better.
You're on a roll.
Every once in a while, I get good on analogies where Miles is like, "Yeah, I like what you're saying." Then I get carried away and get too confident. I get down.
I kick him.
I kick him right over.
Kick him.
I kick him over. I burn him.
So, I mean, things you may or may not know about me, Ben. I don't know if we've ever covered this, but I spent 2 years of my life actually living in Botswana.
No, I didn't know that. Well,
true.
We might have.
True story. When I was in my 20s, my first job out of college was teaching in Southern Africa, right? And so I had a lot of time living in places where I was quite literally the only white person in that neighborhood. And living there it was an incredibly valuable time in my life, and I'm so happy for the time that I spent living and working there. And it was exhausting. And by that I mean constantly being the person who sticks out and constantly being the subject of attention and curiosity and wonderment. Right? You are a symbol of wonder, like, wow.
Look at that guy.
What are you?
That's like Phil. Phil's like that here.
That's true.
That requires
exactly the same experience.
That requires a lot of energy all the time. You never get to be relaxed. Yeah. When you are completely out of your element and you are the thing, the object of curiosity, you don't ever get to be off or just chill.
Yeah.
So I think that a hunting camp for a person of color is a very different experience than it is for me, having just left hunting camp for the past 5 days, where I could just be as calm as possible and just be in my space and myself and just be dirty and nasty and not worry about what I'm saying or how I'm saying it or how I present myself. That is the opposite of the experience that I had when I was living in Botswana for 2 years, where I was constantly aware of how my presence was being interpreted because I was the symbol of all whiteness.
Yeah.
Whatever I did, according to these people, because it's their personal experience, was emblematic of white. That's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, you're like, hey, let's read a book. White people read books. I do. And I think there's an understanding that I even would admit to not having about those things. And I think that's where the nervousness comes from. That's where my own personal angst comes from around these topics, because I don't want to fall in some trap. I don't want to fall prey to the outrage machine, but I do want to understand what you're talking about. Having never been through it myself, and that's when you bring up terms like white privilege. That thing's as charged, like socially and politically charged, as like assault weapon or trophy hunting or all these things that we use. So when you start talking about privilege, immediately you're like, you have to have a thought, and
you're
generally going to be triggered one way or the other. So I think Carolyn did a great job of addressing that part for sure. But there's a lot of kind of like little booby traps in this conversation.
I think that the piece, and I'm just imagining the folks out there listening to this who are already being perhaps triggered or skeptical based on like, oh, God damn it, why do I have to think about this in relation to hunting? Why can't I just have one part of my life where I don't have to think about like privilege or class or socioeconomic stuff? Like, why do we have to taint it? And I know how I would respond to that, but I'm wondering what your response is to those folks.
That's life. Get over it. Like, it's life. Sports. I love sports. I like football. You like football. You know what football is? Cultural, social, political. It's like the entertainment industry is that way. Everything is fraught with these big things we have to approach and deal with. And it's up to us to determine how we do that. And if we're going to write that off because we just want to have a good time, you're never going to be a really good representative of hunting unless you can do these things, I feel. A lot of people might disagree with that, but I feel like these kind of ideas and these kind of thought processes, I may have made the mistake of being a little bit self-congratulatory within these conversations. Like, I'm doing it and you're not. Like, that's stupid. Because talking to a real smart black lady is somehow courageous. It's not. But I want to, we should normalize it at least. We're not going to overplay it. We're not going to bring it up every conversation. This is one of very many important issues that we'll discuss on this podcast. But we should at least normalize getting over it and talking about it and having it be a part of the lexicon. Like, that's, if we can just do that and make everyone comfortable with that, then eventually we'll just move in the right direction, which we are. But I think the hunting community stands as a mostly white male dominated thing. And we should address that shit. And however we do it, it's up to the individual. But in this podcast, we're just going to talk about it. And we're going to find real smart people like yourself and others to just kind of help us through it.
But my question now to you, because I think all that's valid, and again, I know how I would answer this question, but I think people listening want to know how you're going to answer this question. What benefit does the hunting community get
from this conversation?
What is the benefit to the hunting community by having to address itself as being primarily white male? And what's wrong with it being a white male space?
Okay, there's two things. We'll start by saying, frankly, this. I want when something's primarily, like you're just discussing, when something is primarily one thing, it's never going to be welcoming to the folks that aren't that one thing, right? So diversity in this case is allowing hunting to grow in a way that it wouldn't if it's going to be primarily white for the history of time. Like, the changing demographics are important. We should want to change the demographics in a positive way. So eventually, when minorities look at hunting, they see a tapestry. They don't see a monolith. Like, they see this very bright, colorful thing that has all kinds of cultural influences, and it's kind of a melting pot of ideas and experiences and people. That's a welcoming place to be. What's not a welcoming place is 98% white dudes. It's just not going to be. So if we want to change hunting, that's conceptually one way to do it. And when I look at why I'm here, why I'm sitting here, I love hunting. If I remove my personal love for it, there's a collective idea that we got to grow it. We got to make it more acceptable. We have to increase its importance in the culture and our society. And one of the only ways to do that is to bring in people that can both add to our collective juice, like that can give us something that we don't currently have, but at the same time, there's more of us. There's more understanding. So if you're not willing to do this kind of thing and you want to be kind of minimalist and reductionist about how you reach out, then you're never really going to create the thing that needs to be created, like I feel. And so, but there's other elements to why we need to have this conversation. Hunting is falling. We want it to grow. There's 13% of America is African American. That's the tactical way to approach that.
I think that your response addresses why it's good for the 2% of non-white hunters who exist out there. I don't think it necessarily addresses like why that 98% should care. And so I'll put out an idea, a thought.
I think it does, though. I think it says, listen, man, like the only way this goes forward, we've already seen this. The only way this goes forward is if it's socially acceptable. The question that is being asked in our culture is this good? Is it good, and is the motivation good? And if that question is being asked and it's being answered by a wide swath of very diverse people that is growing, then we have a better chance of getting what we desire, which is more access, more hunting, like better ways to have our society understand this thing. So if you're in the current hunting community and you need a better understanding of that, that's what I would tell you. I would just tell you that this is all about understanding, and we currently have a misunderstanding with this group of people. We just do.
I don't even know what step further, just slightly different tack. I would say that I think we live in a culture that is increasingly and more aggressively siloed all the time. And it's easier for us to escape into our small little silos, whether that's how we consume news, whether it's the way that we choose to socialize, whether it's the way we choose to consume sports, whether it's the way we choose to have leisure activities. It is so easy for us to not leave these pockets of comfort all the time now.
Yeah.
I can go to work, I can go home, I can watch the shows I like, I can consume the news I like, I can go to the websites I like, and I can almost never be confronted in a meaningful way with ideas or perspectives that are different from or challenging to my own. I think that we as individuals grow and learn and become more dynamic, positive, well-meaning, better contributors in general, and more confident people when we have to confront other perspectives and be comfortable with that and be able to adapt to that and be able to react to that in meaningful ways. And I think that goes for hunting significantly. Hunting and fishing. I'm not going to cut fishing out of this. I'm the fishing director. Let's talk about fishing too. Fishing is exceptionally white. It fits into this conversation. I think that when hunting and fishing are these spaces where I can just go there and not be confronted with any sense of difference or anything that is challenging, that is a diminishment of my experience because it's too easy for me to just settle into it and never have to see a different perspective.
Yeah, and then that gets into so many other topics, right? The death of journalism, like all these things, that how we communicate with each other, what we expect from each other, what the national consciousness is, kind of like the idiocracy that we might slip into if we get, if The Rock is the next president of the United States. Like this is all, it's all tied together. Like we really should have an expectation that this thing can be better, and I believe this is one of the ways it can. I do not subscribe, people that know me, to social justice, like in the way that it's manifested itself in this world. There are a lot of really good things we can change. There's one big swath of this country that is going about it in the wrong way. Like they're using victimhood as a way to gain power, and like there's a lot of shit that I don't agree with. I push that all aside in this conversation. Like I push that all aside. I'm like, okay, this is an equation. Like currently what we're doing ain't working. I mean, I don't have the numbers of growth of African-American hunters in this nation, but I'm pretty sure those numbers don't exist because they're not growing. And so we need to address that. And the only way to do that is understand first why it's not happening. And somebody like Carolyn Finney can help us get there a little bit further. And that's why I didn't want to just have some black hunter on to tell me their experience. We'll get there. Obviously, I mean, I've had those folks on this podcast before, but I mean, I think it just takes a broader understanding of what's going on before we can really go.
I completely agree, and I think that the fundamental argument that has to be had before we can start talking about the how is the why.
Yeah.
Right. And so to me, and I can't speak for anybody else, but I'm going to say that my experience as a hunter and as a member of this community becomes more interesting and richer when I'm not just looking at dudes with beards who are white and come from a similar background as myself.
For sure. Like our podcast producer, Corinne, has brought Carolyn Finney wouldn't be on the show if it wasn't for her, right? And but she brings this, she's lived in New York, and she brings these different sensibilities to the table, and I could either fight that and be like, no, that's not how we do things. Or when she brings these things up, I'm like, damn man, let's find a real nice way to address this thing you brought up that's valid. And we had an article on our website, which you'll remember very well, entitled
wait, let me was it a question? Was it framed as a question?
It was framed as a question. Is hunting too white? And that, I think in the arena where that lived, I mean, that's a very, you put that on Facebook and it's a very, just read the headline and give a comment. In this space where we can have a 2-hour discussion, this can actually move us somewhere. All that thing did, we dropped it somewhere, and all that thing did was just get people talking about the subject again in what seemed like a pretty unhealthy way in a lot of instances. So I think hopefully this will do that, and I do very much understand that there's some people that just don't want to listen to this shit, and they don't want to have to deal with it, and they don't want somebody to push it on them. And so if that's you, I'm sure you've already stopped listening. You're welcome to stop listening right now. I could give two shits. But if you want to explore this with us, this is hopefully a conversation that will help you understand some things. Because I very much went into the conversation with Carolyn Finney wanting to learn and wanting just to ask her, hey, I know I don't get this. I know I don't have the right perspective here. What do I do? What can I do? And then it's up to me to determine from there where I go. What I do. If I want to read more about John Muir and his racist tendencies and look back at some of the early conservation pioneers and kind of how they felt and some of the early institutions that were created and the basis on which they were created. That's, I think, the most tangible thing that I've taken away from this thus far. I'm sure there'll be more, but that for me is where it landed. And so I think it's positive. Phil, go ahead and bring us home, bud.
Well, I mean, honestly, I think Miles kind of gave a really good summary of this whole conversation, like pretty much right up front was the being allowed versus being welcome. And you can't just ignore thousands of years of historical context to where we are today.
No, but I didn't do anything.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's like, whatever. Ben just said that the term, like white privilege is immediately like, bing, like your hairs stick up and it's you have a response to it, but it is privilege to be able to like ignore things.
Absolutely.
And I think having empathy is the most important thing we can have in any space. And I think it takes a lot of empathy to kind of have these to explore these things. So
God, you're so good at this, Phil. I thought you were just going to say, no, I'm not going to say anything. But you're good.
Hey, everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. Meat Eater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the engineer is going to be there. Meat Eater Live headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay, every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Art Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.
All right, well, we'll dive into the conversation with Carolyn Finney. Like I said at the outset of this, it's we're going to keep having it. We're going to keep talking about this stuff and find better ways to address it. So hopefully you follow along with us. But for now, please welcome Carolyn Finney.
I guess I grew up on an older road, a pedal to the metal.
Hey, Carolyn, how are you?
I am good.
It sounds like it. You're all the way in Vermont. I wanted to be there in the room with you today, but I was just telling you if I had to tell you the story of why I'm not there, it would be longer than the podcast. So we'll do it. We're having a rare phone interview, but thanks for taking the time, man. I'm excited to talk about some of these subjects.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the show. I'm excited.
Yeah, I've been. I would just say before we get started, like there's the show that we do here and some of the conversation we have. I get excited when it seems like, at least on its face, that there's a conversation that I'm not supposed to have or something I'm not supposed to be particularly interested in or topics that just seem either within the culture that I run or within the culture overall that seem to be, hard to broach or hard to understand. These are things that kind of pique my interest. So when our producer Corinne passed me over your book, Black Faces, White Spaces, it took me a minute to realize the relevance, but as soon as I read it and started reading some of your other works and interviews, I realized like this is a conversation that I want to have. I just don't know how to have it. So
and I want to say to you, and I tell people that I work with all the time around this, groups and organizations, and that's part of the work, right? Is how to have the conversation. It's not just the substance of what it is that we're reading about or thinking about, but how do we actually be in conversation with each other around this.
Right, because if we're being honest, I'm a 33-year-old white male that lives in Bozeman, Montana, and I have a hunting podcast.
Yeah.
I'm not. I don't think I'm expected to or demanded, at least in the hunting community, even in the greater outdoor community. It's not that I'm being demanded to talk about this or that anybody is pushing me towards this subject, but it's an important one, and I think it's one that a lot of people are nervous about, me included. I know I don't have the proper perspective, so I'm hoping that we can get there today.
Yes, absolutely. And, I always tell people, you don't know what you don't know.
Yes.
There's something in that,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I was thinking about how to at least broach the subject of African Americans in the outdoors. And there's you go into a lot of the history and a lot of idiosyncrasies within kind of the conversation. But when I read it, I don't necessarily have any, I'm not going to say I have guilt around this, but I want to just simply say that the outdoors, specifically in my case, hunting, has given me a lot. And it sucks for me to think that many people feel as they don't belong in these places because these places have meant so much to me. So that's, I think, the first, the thing that struck me from your book was that.
Yes. And so a couple of things I want to throw out there in no apparent order. One, if you haven't read it, and you probably have, there's a Black hunter, it's a friend of mine named Jonathan Hall, who he is a professor in West Virginia, and he wrote a piece for Rewire News. It calls Notes from an Angry Black Hunter, Guns, Genocide, and the Stolen Ground You Own. And it is just really powerful with images of himself because he's a hunter, and he's out there all the time, and he does a really excellent job, I think, of talking about, how this is personal. And that's the thing that I always come to this, people might, can read the book or are sort of looking at that I'm talking about history. And actually the reason I've come to this work is because it's personal. I can never leave my skin at home, right? So the fact of the matter is I've spent my time backpacking all around the world, and I'm fortunate enough to have also, I travel a lot and I love that. And, at first glance, when you see me now, I'm very urban. I'm from New York originally, and I have this very urban feel about me. But there was a period of time of 5 years. I was just in my backpacking gear in Africa and Asia and Nepal. I was just all over the place before social media, and when I was a younger person and doing those things all the time. I want to say that there's something about what I can never get away from, and Jonathan talks about this as well, is how we are perceived, because we live in a country, 400, 500 years of history that we've never actually fully reconciled. And the fact of the matter is, while, if we talk about the environment, broadly defined nature, the environment, the woods, even though we lived in a country where Jim Crow segregation was in place for many, many years, and in some places, one would argue you have to think twice about it, depending on who you are, if you want to walk in those spaces. Even though we didn't talk about nature in the woods being like that, it was also like that. It actually didn't matter. So if we talked about you weren't allowed to go into a movie theater in the 40s or 50s, you also weren't allowed to go on the beach, the same beach as white people during the 40s and 50s in some places. The fact of the matter is it didn't make a difference if it was a beautiful park or beautiful woods to go hunting in. If you were non-white, there were different kinds of risks you were taking, because look, we live in a country where, one, we stole all the land from American Indians.
Yep.
Let's just be real, right? And we still haven't reconciled that. And then we enslaved a whole bunch of people to work as someone else's property to build up our economy.
Yeah.
Right. So, and let's not even talk about everything from the Chinese Exclusion Act to the Japanese internment to all the things that we have done and continue to do in terms of, we continue to do to say who belongs here and who doesn't, and how one belongs here. So even if you are here, how you are treated and how you are seen. And we don't like to talk about this stuff out loud, except in the last couple of years, we've been doing it a lot, because we have a present administration that has allowed that in a very different way. Right. So I don't want to get political, but just to say, it's real. And for a lot of us, like people like myself, there's no surprise here for me. Right. There's no surprise. So when some of my white friends are just like, oh my God, I can't believe that people are saying this. And I'm just looking at them and going, this is what we've been saying to you, that many of us live with this on a daily for years. And it's not to say things haven't improved from the 50s and 60s, they have. And there's a way within which we haven't reconciled certain things around that. So whether you're hunting, whether you're out hiking, whether you're camping, whether you're trying to find a job working in an outdoor agency, all of these things are going to impact, all of these things are impacted by a history that we have yet to reconcile.
Yeah, that term reconcile is really, it seems like it's striking in a lot of ways and what you talk about. And I was just looking at Jonathan Hall's article.
Yes.
I remember that he was on Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, an episode that I saw and that I thought was really great.
Oh, yeah.
And like he says, 90% of the land is owned by white Americans. There's this feeling, at least in my mind, if I could just make it personal for me, because I think there's a lot of people that are probably in my position where, like, listen, we celebrate. I sit on the board of an organization called Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, and we celebrate public lands. I mean, that's what we're all about. Access is a huge term within our space.
Yeah.
And when I think of access, I don't necessarily think of the history of access. I think of this emblematic public place where anyone can go if they so desire. But what I have never addressed in my own mind, and I think what maybe is scary to think of, is the cultural baggage that comes with these things. And that's just something I've never thought about because I've never been faced with it personally.
Right. And that was for me, that was beautifully said. That's it. That's why I say in my most generous way, we don't know what we don't know. If I was going to be a little kind of tougher with it, I would say privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. And everyone has privilege. I want to be really clear about this to anybody listening. But we all don't have the same privileges in the same way at the same time in the same spaces. And so part of that is really understanding that you haven't had to think about it, which is great. Actually, I wish no one had to think about it because it sucks. I can tell you, I have to think about it because I'm so aware, and I have been reminded my entire life of my difference, for better or for worse. There it is, right? And that it plays out in some people's minds in different parts of the country. I mean, I was just living in Kentucky for 4 years. Interesting and on many levels. And I was just back there maybe a month or so ago because I was an artist in residence in this retreat with a number of women who were writing about nature. And so we were staying outside of Louisville on this property. It is hundreds of acres of this. I think it's owned by some kind of land conservancy, but there's a small piece of it that this foundation had a house and a space for writers and artists to come and spend time in. And they told us, they said, it's hunting season. So they said, if you want to go out, you can go out walking on the property because it's really beautiful and there's woods. And but if you're going to do it, you want to wear the orange, the hunting jacket, just so the hunters see you there. I have to tell you, whether it was reasonable or not, I didn't go out, even with that on, because I thought to myself, and after Jonathan's article, and I said, I don't know how I feel about that, meaning hunters, like everybody else, are individuals, and individuals with their own set of biases. We are all biased, right? And frankly, I just didn't want to be out in the woods by myself, even with a hunting thing on, just in case. I don't know. It would probably be fine.
Yeah,
he says that I even have to consider it. That's what I mean, right?
Yeah, Jonathan says that in his article. He's like, I don't hunt public land because white men with firearms and a reason to discharge said firearms make me incredibly nervous. That is something like I would never have thought of that. That's not something. Me too. I would have been like, come on, like I would never think that way. But the fact that some do is certainly worth addressing. And as you say,
if you another thing, I would offer for your readers the story of Eddie Harris. Eddie Harris is a fabulous. He considers himself he's a black outdoor sportsman, and he loves fly fishing, and he's written a number of books. When he was 30, his first book was called Mississippi Solo, because he decided he was going to take a canoe down the length of the Mississippi River, and he'd never canoed before. But he tells a story in one of his other books about how he's down somewhere in the South and he's camping and, traveling with the gun, but not because he's a hunter, because he's just like, I'm a black man. I'm going to be out camping in the woods in the South. And the fact of the matter is, you don't know what's up. Right. And so you have to prepare for that differently. And hopefully nothing bad ever happens. But sometimes something bad does happen. I mean, I'm going to say this, a black woman just got shot in her own home and killed. I mean, for me, these are not unassociated.
Yeah.
So, do I feel am I going to feel any more safe and protected out in the woods?
Yeah. Listen, I don't. Here's my comparison. The only as you speak about this, I try to just kind of in my own mind rationalize some of it and compare some of it. Like I grew up in Maryland, and I did not grow up in Baltimore. I grew up in Western Maryland, which is basically East West Virginia. It's just the little panhandle area where you could consider it to be pretty rural in that way.
Okay.
When we would go to Baltimore to go to a sports game or go whatever, West Baltimore is a pretty rough place. And it's mostly African American. And when I would go there, when drive through there, I would immediately feel uncomfortable. And I don't, that's not to say that any of those emotions are right or wrong, but I did because that's just what it was. And so I don't mean to compare that to what you're saying, but just trying to think and relate to what that might feel like.
And I think that's important too. I mean, I always say you got to start where you are, and so while there are differences I can point to, what's real for you and for me as human beings, what is that comes up, the fear of not knowing, the insecurity that one can feel about being in a space where especially when you're in a space with people who are not you, who don't look like you, and most importantly, who you don't know.
Right.
And to understand that all of us in this country have been educated either consciously or subconsciously about our history, everything that we learn in school. I always say to people, there's all the stuff that we learn and there's all the stuff we are never told. Right.
I like
it. And and there's a lot of that, right? And so there's all those subconscious messages, that teachers and books we're given and the choices that were made. I'm not saying that they're bad or good. I'm just saying that we have never been given the complete and all the information, right, out there to choose from. And all of our legislation, all of our policy, if I think about all these environmental organizations, historically, their mission statements, in part, were founded around an aspiration for, protecting public lands. And I think all of that's a really good thing, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, look, I served on the National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years. So I'm also about thinking about public lands, actually all land, but public lands in particular, and how we can care for them and be in better relationship to them. And I also understand that when a lot of those mission statements were written, again, Jim Crow was in place. So what were they actually thinking? Who were they talking about? Who's the we, right?
Yeah.
In that.
Yeah.
To understand that everybody in that we can't operate in the same way, doesn't have the same choice. So if we jump ahead and understand why we don't see a lot of folks of color in leadership positions in these organizations, that's no accident. And I'm not saying somebody set out intentionally and said, we're not hiring any Black people. What I'm saying is that that's what happens over time. Right? You wouldn't see those folks sitting around the table because they wouldn't have been invited. They weren't part of that, of developing that mission statement. How could they be?
Yeah. Yeah. And right? I think I know in reading Jonathan Hall's article and in reading your book, it's like we can be in this, especially in this world that we live in now, there's certain terms that just light people up. Like privilege, white privilege is one of those terms that even me as a white man, I'm like, don't label me. Like, come on, man.
Right.
Like, don't label me with this.
Well, you notice how I said privilege, right?
Right. So I think just to address that, privilege, I like that you say privilege, and I just want to make sure, because we have terms in our space, in the hunting space, like trophy hunting, assault weapon, all these things that kind of trigger a feeling, and then somebody turns the logical part.
Triggered a feeling.
Yeah, see?
It did that.
Told you. You turn off the logical part of your brain, you start to get emotional about what you just heard, having the baggage of what's already been discussed. So it's worth to address that.
It is. And so I want to say something about privilege, white privilege, and I want to say something about that too. I purposefully said, because we all do have privilege. And I said that in a wide variety of ways, in part because my own intention in doing the work that I do in terms of having these conversations is I want to meet people where they are. And what I'm most interested in is our collective capacity to change and be in better relationship with each other across our differences. So I'm not interested in coming to a room and shutting people down because I know exactly what those words are. Having said that, it is also important to me when talking about race in this country, whiteness is not a bad thing. So nobody can help the skin they were born in. And white people are diverse as any other group of people. I want to make sure that I say that really clear. And I want to borrow James Baldwin's words to say that whiteness in this country is about power. To understand that, again, what gave people the right to kill people, to remove them from land in order to get that, to enslave a whole nother group of people, and none of those people were white. Right. And I'm not saying the Irish, there are groups. I understand those differences, but understand that this country was built. I mean, we had presidents writing in the Constitution who had slaves. That's the complexity of it. You know, it's complex. It doesn't mean that Thomas Jefferson was an awful human being, but it means he's complicated because he actually felt it was okay to have people as slaves. That we have to consider that. Yeah. We have to consider that. And so white privilege is meant to signify that whiteness. When we use the word normal, when we talk about this is the normal thing to do, to be able to say where whiteness is at the center of that and how whiteness as power, right? Not the individual, but as power is colored, no pun intended, everything, you know, from the language we use to the kind of what we say is right and wrong, what we say is when we talk about morality, all of it, what we have, what becomes privileged in that means that everybody else who is not white, who doesn't identify as white, comes up against that all the time, and historically has come up against it all the time. So that's really what white privilege means. It doesn't mean that your whiteness is bad. It doesn't mean that you are bad. You can't help the skin you were born in, right? Any more than I can. Yeah. And in this country, whiteness has been privileged. This isn't an opinion. Actually, it is a fact. And all you have to do is look at the history of understanding how it has been privileged over time. It's privileged in terms of beauty. It is privileged on so many levels. And so how do we contend with that? That's the reconciliation. It's not about making it bad. I'm not interested in oppressing anybody. Yeah. So I'm interested in, but how do we own our collective past, which I believe we are all complicit in?
That is like to call for that is absolutely appropriate in every way, and like calling for that in this day and age seems to make people uncomfortable. And I know, that Jonathan Hall in his writing is talking about like, can we have a conversation about what justice looks like in the aftermath of genocide and anti-Black violence? And he's talking about this in like feeling welcome on public lands and what it really is. And he said the answer from the hunting community has been a definitely loud but silent no. Yeah. And I see his I don't know that this has been collectively thought about or talked about enough. I don't know that there's been a no. There just hasn't been a push to be like, there has been a push to say, we want a more diverse hunting community. We want more people to come and experience this thing that we think makes our lives better. We want them to get their food in this way, but we're just not sure how to do it. And we don't know how to have the conversation about the past because it gets a little scary.
Yeah, and that is right on point. So because I work with so many organizations, predominantly white organizations that are around environment, sometimes it's nonprofits. I mean, it's gotten so diverse now that people who call me in, and this is something that I've heard them say almost exactly the way you just said it, which is, we're not saying no, we just don't know how to do it. And it's kind of scary to kind of come to this. And I'm like, that's real. I get that. And I want to also say, and I'm not speaking for Jonathan, I'm just saying that there is one of the things that can be frustrating for those of us like myself who've been doing this for a while is that how can I put this? There's a way within which we're not seeing anything change. So when you understand that you've heard people say that for years, and nothing's really changing on the surface. There's not any new leadership of color. There are not any real attempts at. So let me come at it in a different way. If you want to do something really different, and I always say this to people, this is not about being comfortable, right? There's nothing in this conversation that it's about being comfortable. That is not, nor should be, I believe, the goal. If you think about, there's so many of us who have never been comfortable. But I often use an example, and you may have heard it, or I may have written it somewhere, that a couple of years ago, when Svetlana Alexievich won the Nobel Prize for her work on Chernobyl, and she's from Belarus, and I heard her on NPR. And one of the things that the person on NPR was saying to her, Michelle Martin, was saying, you made a lot of people uncomfortable, because a lot of her people in Belarus were mad at her. It's like she exposed the dirty laundry about how the government was at fault and what the problems were and why Chernobyl happened. And she basically responded, she said, I'm not interested in my people being comfortable. I love my people. I want them to be better. Right. And so there's something about how do we shift the thinking from, we're all uncomfortable. Come on board. That's what I said. Right? So really, and that's when you start to build a kind of trust and a relationship, and we can really start to get real about where we all are at, what we are saying we collectively want, and deciding what we're willing to actively do. Because I always say to people, this is about taking risks, and not risks in order not to lose something you already have. It's about you take a risk in order to gain something that you're saying you want. And that's a gamble, which means a person has to put themselves out there, knowing that, oh my God, I might say the wrong thing. I might do the thing in the wrong way. It's talking about, it may be a letting go of some of those. When a person, I'm not putting anything in front of it, has had a privilege for a long time in terms around the question of power, of being able to stand in a position, you know how hard it is to get that person to give any of that up?
Yeah.
And so how they can say, and I recognize that as a human being, like it's just, those who believe and have worked hard for what they've got. I think about my father. He worked hard his entire life. He came from pretty much nothing, high school education, fought in the Korean War, loves his guns. Can't even talk to that man about his guns.
I like him.
Yeah. He's a little, I'm his daughter. So, he's got Alzheimer's now. And so it's kind of sad to watch the loops and the sort of the decline in a certain way. But there's something, the anger that he has held against how I've watched him over the years when I was younger, just how he's had to always feel like he's had to fight. And for everything, always, about even just his presence somewhere and the strategy and the ducking and weaving, and it had to happen, the lack of acknowledgement for who he is and what he's done and what he's sacrificed. Even coming back from the Korean War, he talked about that, being Black and not getting veterans benefits, like the whole 9 yards. When you've had to live with that your entire life, no matter how hard you worked, no matter how much you've made, quote unquote, the right choices to support your family. He's one of thousands, who've had that experience and continue to have that.
Yeah,
and
there's a
somebody else.
When you explain, when you were just talking about taking a gamble to have this conversation, I was like, yeah, that's how I feel. I was like, to me, I felt like this is, even having this conversation in a public forum is a gamble.
Yes, it is.
But then when you can relate it to somebody like your dad, and I want to get to your kind of story growing up, because I think in your book and other places you really touched on it's important. But it feels like a gamble because you're just not sure if you're going to say the wrong thing. And in our incredibly woke internet outrage world, like everybody's walking on a tightrope, especially in these circumstances. But here's where I start and end the conversation. For me personally, I'm like, African Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population. They, by all accounts, they make up less than 2% of American hunters. Like, so if I'm addressing how to make hunting better, I want them in this very confusing, very fraught historical boat with me to go and explore these things. I want them in. And so if I gotta like gamble a little bit and take some chances with this conversation and get to those places, that's what I want to do, because I think it'll mean something in the end, and can be
Yes.
meaningful.
Yeah. Yes. And a few things I want to say. And one, and this is not touting my own, blowing my own horn. This is just in part to make the point. This is what I do day in and day out. I move based on work doing this. Every time I enter into the conversation, I'm taking a risk. It makes me nervous, like you, because in the day of social media, people, and it's already happened to me. I mean, a number of years ago, I was in California, and somebody I knew from high school who I hadn't talked to in years suddenly sent me, through Facebook. She said, I'm sitting in the back of a cab in New York City, and the cab driver has the Rush Limbaugh show on. And they were talking about how crazy you are because you said trees are racist. I'd never said that. That's crazy. Right? But you know what? I had to get off Twitter and I don't even I'm not even on it. But at the time I said I couldn't look at it because I was getting the nastiest, meanest emails. One person even saying, I'm sorry, I have to share this earth with you. It was, and I don't have thick skin. Like, it's just like that hurt. I'm a human being. It really hurt. And I said, my God, I don't even know who these people are. Like, that's not even what I said. So yeah, I'm taking a risk every single time. And there's a lot of emotional labor, but it's also because I believe in something that our capacity as human beings to be better than we are and be in better relationship with each other without having to become who the other person is. Because for me, it's not about assimilation. It's about just how we get better at respectfully, recognizing a person's difference, because that's, this conversation, anything can emerge from this. And we have no idea knowing what that is. And that's the beauty of it, especially when having these conversations about how we can do these things differently and how we can show up differently. So the risk is also about, yes, you could say the wrong thing. Number one, I want to say, it's not like I've gone through my life and never not said the wrong thing. Okay. Wish that were true.
Me too.
No, it's not. And I replay those moments in my head all the time going, I can't even believe it. For me, it's how do you show up after you do that? That's the moment. Knowing that you may be rejected, that somebody might be mad at you. How do you still show up? How are you accountable for that? How are we all accountable? And for me, I'm not interested in, one of the biggest challenges I'm having with our popular culture right now is that if we see someone, in an effort to show that we're woke, and I say that in quotes, if we see that someone has dissed Black people, dissed women, whatever the thing is that we've done in our past, we shut them out. They're out. They're done. We're done with them forever. So there's no opportunity. And I'm saying that whatever they've done, they should be held accountable. But it's not about, leaving them out in the cold. Because if we start doing that, pretty much everybody's going to be out in the cold. Because I really don't know anyone who hasn't made a mistake, said something hurtful, done something hurtful, either consciously or unconsciously. So how do we bring people back in? So I'm always saying, yeah, you know what? You're right. You might say it in the wrong way, and the other person will let you know. Then how do you show up? That's how trust gets built.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of a power dynamic there. Like, who gets to decide? Yes. Who gets to decide who says what in the wrong way? Who gets to decide, when this outrage is appropriate, when it's not? Like, I think your question around how do we have this conversation in a way that makes the outdoors, hunting, whatever outdoor activity, doesn't really matter. Just in this case, in my experience, hunting is my favorite part of it, but it doesn't have to be that. We know the facts, right? We know that less people do it. We know there's this sordid history around this stuff that we don't like to talk about. But in the more modern, I want to maybe walk back this a little bit in a while, but I think in the more modern sense, if you would have to address this and say, like, there's less than 2% of American hunters are African American, and even your book, in the title, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans in the Outdoors, if we were to reimagine African Americans' relationship with hunting, or let's just make it broad, hunting, fishing, hiking, climbing, how do you think about that? How do you begin to think about that?
Well, so partly, and you will know this, but the reason I was drawn to write the book, it was not because, I was in academia and I had to write a book. That wasn't it at all. It was incredibly personal for me. It was personal when I realized, I grew up a half an hour outside of New York City. on land that didn't belong to us. It was owned by a very wealthy Jewish family that had 12 acres of land, and they needed full-time caretakers on that property. And so my parents were the caretakers for that property for nearly 50 years. And it has woods and wildlife and a lake and a swimming pool, stunning piece of property. We lived in the gardener's cottage in a very wealthy white neighborhood. We were the only family of color in that neighborhood. And towards the end of the 90s, when both the owners, one had already died, the other got very sick. And the question was, what's going to happen with my family? Because they've been on this land for so long. And the original owner wanted to try to keep them on the property, I have to say. But there was no way. The property was worth over $3 million. The property taxes were $125,000 a year. There was no way my parents could stay on. So she had a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia. And she passed away. A new owner came on. My parents stayed on for another 5-7 years until they found a new family to move in. And then in the early 2000s, they moved to Virginia. Now, when they moved to Virginia, beautiful house, not much land, like on a half an acre of property. I watched my father in particular get incredibly depressed. And he talked a lot about missing the land back in New York. Soon after they moved, they got a copy of a letter from one of their neighbors there in New York, who said that a group called the Westchester Conservation Land Trust had put a conservation easement on that piece of land that I grew up on. And in the letter, it had all the images. It talked about all the wildlife on the property and all the environmental values of the property and why it needed to be protected. Because when you put a conservation easement on a piece of land, that means in perpetuity, nothing can be changed on that piece of land. At the end of the letter, which I have a copy of, it thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. The new owner had been on there maybe 3 years. There was nothing in the letter acknowledging my parents who had cared for that land for 50 years. And just that fast, they got erased. And that's, I had gone back to school. I was working on my doctorate. I was looking at issues around environment. I was focused on women a little bit more than anything at that particular time. I was doing work in Nepal. And I started realizing, asking the question, whose ownership counts, like how fast my parents got erased. And then I started thinking about the history of the country and all the people we don't see, particularly folks of color that are always been there on the land, caring for, engaging with it, hunting, fishing, doing all those things, but they're not part of the bigger story. We're not talking. It's like we just don't see them. And then it kind of rolls into this myth, such as Black people they don't do this sort of thing. They don't hike, they don't camp, they don't hunt, whatever it is. And actually, none of that is true, right? It actually comes back to what we haven't, this is not what we're taught in school. These aren't the stories we see on television. These aren't the stories we read in the books. And so that's why I wanted to reimagine it. I wasn't saying that so much for African Americans necessarily. Here's all the things you can do, though that's in there a little bit. I was actually saying to everyone else, actually, we've always been here doing it. So how do we consider that, And that's why I wanted to talk to Black people around the country and say, tell me your story. What's your environmental story? Like what's the experience of your grandparents? Like where'd you grow up? What were you doing in the outdoors? And some of the folks would say to me, I don't have an environmental story. And I'm like, of course you do. Everyone does. If you're breathing, you've got one. Doesn't matter if you lived in a city, if you lived in a rural area. And then they would spill out sometimes these incredible stories. I found myself sitting in the trailer of one of the Tuskegee Airmen in Florida who had worked in agriculture before. I mean, I was meeting these people. Of course, they have these amazing stories. And that's what I wanted to reimagine, was actually there is this full, rich relationship there, but it butts up against a history. And when that history that hasn't invited it in, right? So now we're here. That's why you've got all these organizations formed, these cultures, cultural practices around, whether it's hunting, whether it's hiking or mountain climbing, whatever it is, that have privileged a particular experience and perspective. And there's nothing wrong with that experience or perspective, but it's been privileged as though nothing else actually exists.
Yeah, and that's huge. And when I was reading your stuff and thinking about this, I thought about this a lot. I was probably sitting by myself on the couch at home, sweating, thinking about this.
I'm sorry that you were sweating. But,
I don't know, man. It's just being honest. But the relationship to place is something that struck me, because when I think about my relationship to the place and the people around me, I have this like, it's not a pure relationship to place, but it certainly is it's what I feel like a more comfortable relationship to a place, because I can look at, Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir and Gifford Pinchot and all these folks.
Yeah.
I can look at them and I can idolize them, and I can kind of trace the lineage there, and I can look at all these things in a fairly pragmatic way. We talk about our model of conservation on this show quite a lot, and the folks that formed that model of conservation, and even the folks that then articulate it many decades later, were all white and all came from a place of power and privilege, and that all comes back to, like, you talk about relationship to place and how our ethnicity influences the way we see places. And that's the thing that struck me the most, is like thinking about how is my ethnicity and my upbringing and what I've done affect the way I see places, the outdoors specifically in this conversation. Can you kind of just go through that a little bit for people and try to make them understand in the way that I was able to through reading your work?
I can. I will say I can't make them understand, but I can certainly
give it a shot.
To consider. I can invite them to consider.
That is the only point of this, is just let's invite folks to consider some things maybe they haven't.
Yes. So I want to start, when you start talking about President Roosevelt and John Muir, and often when I'm, one of the things I do is I put up a slide that has a collage that I put together, a collage of images. So something from Japanese internment and American Indians and immigrants at the border and slavery. And then right in the middle, I put, there's a famous picture of President Roosevelt with John Muir on overhanging rock in Yosemite. It's 1903. And I put that right in the middle. And then I put another picture of Gifford Pinchot off to the side. And I say, those two men, Roosevelt and Muir, I imagine are having an amazing conversation. They're thinking really seriously about ideas of wilderness. How are we as Americans going to engage and protect this wilderness? And that's really great. If you also read the writings of John Muir, which I have, as well as Roosevelt, it makes them complicated, because John Muir did not have nice things to say about Black people, in his own words. Not a lot of nice things to say about American Indians either. And Roosevelt was also, he talked in his words. He said basically that, the white Americans, white race, were the higher race, and that had responsibility. I mean, that's the complexity. So if we are going to embrace that we want to love and uphold John Muir and Roosevelt, we can't pick and choose what parts of their personality or their thinking we want to use for that. I think that's disingenuous.
Yeah.
We actually have to just, guess what? They were smart, powerful men who had some really good ideas. The Civilian Conservation Corps, there were some good ideas up in there. All of those ideas were some good ideas. And guess what? They had some, if I'm going to be gentle about it, prejudices, but, they were also had some racist ideas that in part came from their own privilege, that they could actually hold those perspectives at the same time, that they could talk about nature and wilderness in the way that they did with such love and respect. They had such love and respect for nature, but they did not have that for all their fellow human beings. That's just what it is. And so, and if you're one of those human beings, you're looking at that going, oh, okay, well, where am I in that equation? What does that mean for me? And I always say, there's things that I'm working on a one-woman show that I imagine myself in conversation with John Muir. And a lot of this is that because I want to think about and show people to understand, I don't have to diminish John Muir to make myself, count more. I actually don't want to do that. The point I want to make is he becomes relevant on my terms. He doesn't become irrelevant. He's not irrelevant. I'm part of this country's history. He's had such a huge impact on the way we think about wilderness. Of course he's relevant, but he becomes relevant on my terms because I have to do that because I wasn't relevant on his terms.
Yeah. This all connects, like the relevancy of all this and the complications of all this. It connects. Last show we were talking about, as funny as it won't really relate to this in tangible terms, but in intangible terms we were talking about how we eat meat and regenerative agriculture and different things like that. So we're getting into consumption. And within consumption, it's much easier for folks to just eat the meat and not really worry about where it came from, or just kind of have the ornamental understanding of like, oh, it's organic. Somebody told me it's organic. That's fine. Like, not to have to worry about the complicated nature and the complicated history behind how we eat our food and how we got to where we are. And there's parallels here. It's easier for me to go outside and enjoy these things and celebrate Teddy Roosevelt and celebrate John Muir and these figures who are important. It's easier for me just to do that without having to stomach all the other realities that are there, because it's much easier for me to do, and it's more simple. It makes all these ideas easier to digest, and it strikes me that parallel is it's crazy.
Yes, and I want to say that this is at that point that you just described of that point of it's easier. What I heard you say, it's easier to actually just embrace them, embrace that part of them that we know, not that other stuff, which is ugly and hard. That's actually the point where one can begin if one is actually seriously wanting to engage hunters, in this case, Black hunters, in a different and meaningful way, because that's actually the point. You can't have one without the other, because the Black hunter knows he or she can't have one without the other. Like, I can't come in there and I can try. I'd have to work really hard at shutting out that reality. But what an interesting place to start. That's why it's uncomfortable, right? To go, oh my God. So there's things about Muir that are really funky. There's things about Roosevelt that were really funky around this. Let's talk about that. Let's understand, how is that manifested in the way that we act with each other today? How does that show up? What does that mean? How can I embrace that differently? Can I embrace that differently? Do I want to? I mean, the conversation then opens wide, and a kind of trust gets developed just when people are willing to say, holy crap, that is really, that's overwhelming, but I'm willing to stand with it. Let's stand with it. Let's sit with it for a while and see what happens.
Yeah, and you call it like the aim of your work, you say, is develop a greater cultural competency, and I found that work.
Yes.
I found that to be like, yeah, hell yeah, let's all do that.
Yes.
Let's make sure that we're doing that, and if that's the way, if somebody you've kind of lived your life in this way, and really been able to see kind of the outdoors, even from the way that our government treats the outdoors, from sitting on the National Parks Advisory Board. I mean, you were at UC Berkeley for a time. You've traveled the world. There's all these things that you've done. If you're telling me that the way to speak about this and have a positive impact for the people that are really feeling it is to develop a greater cultural competency, like, let's go. I'm in.
Yes.
I'll do that anytime.
And I would say to your listeners that you don't have to go to school for this. It's not like you suddenly have to read a ton of books. One of the things I always say to folks is, like, what is your environmental story? The first piece of work we all have to do is our own internal assessment. And this is when you got to get real with where you stand, your own biases on your own experience. You don't have to apologize for your life. That's not what I'm saying here. People often interpret it that way.
That's a huge point. Huge point. Like, let's not get into this. Like, I'm not sorry for who I am or what I've done. But I certainly want to be better.
No, right. We're where we are, here we are. And there's a certain amount of understanding your environmental story, if you kind of define what that is, because only you can do that for yourself, and really start to understand how some of those things in some ways became possible because of the space of who you are and how that privilege operated. It doesn't mean you worked any less hard than anybody else, right? But this whole idea of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that's why so many of us rail against that, because that assumes that everybody started from the same place on the starting line. And they didn't. I mean, they just simply didn't. And I don't have to, you just got to look at the history, right? It's hard to start from the same place on the starting line if your ancestors were enslaved and then you were Jim Crow, you were told there were places you couldn't be and go, and you're still getting everything from redlining to shot in your own home. It's hard, okay, to really buy that argument, and understanding. Again, Black people are diverse. You have wealthy Black people, you people with all types of privilege within that. So I don't want to deny that. And we are still having this conversation in the United States of America in 2019. That's no accident.
Yeah, we're a generation away. My dad was there when he was telling me a story. I remember when black people just started going up at our high school. I'm like, we're a generation
Yeah.
away from this stuff. We're not this so far
Yeah.
removed that we can write it off as some sort of historical thing that we've overcome. There's no way that's a silly stand.
Well, you can look at all of our institutions, all of them. So whether they're political, academic, you look at all of our institutions and start to understand where's the money, where's the capital. There was an article that came out, I saw online, that looked at how much of land is privately owned in this country and all the families that own that land. And that you look it up and say where the largest families are in terms of own most of the land in this country. I mean, there's 100 places you can go and you're going to come up with the same answer, and understanding how privilege operates around this conversation. Because historically, there are people who benefited and there are people who have not benefited through no fault on either side in terms of how they were born into the world. Nobody can help that. Nobody can help the color of their skin. And there's a way with legislation, with cultural practices, with education, all of it has geared itself towards a certain color of the skin, right? And not the other. Like, I'm being really simplistic, but just to make the point. And so, and what do we do about that? How is that reconciled? How do we build up trust between each other? To build up trust in any kind of, if I'm making a new friend or if I'm working with somebody, a new colleague, trust in part comes from how much I'm able to show, one, that I'm open to, who you are and how you show up. But I also have to believe you can stand with me and have my back, which doesn't mean you always have to agree with me. There's not the same thing, but it means you're able to see who I am. So I was telling some students yesterday, I said, especially when I was younger, it would be so interesting when some of my white friends would look at me and say, but I don't see the color of your skin. I knew that at the heart of what they were trying to say to me was, you're human, I love you anyway. But it also made me angry because I was like, if you don't see the color of my skin, then you actually don't really understand some of the challenges I might be having in the world in comparison to you.
Yeah, well, that's a deflection, right? Too, you're just like, I don't see the color of your skin because if I see it, then I got to talk about some shit.
Yes,
I really don't want to talk about.
Exactly.
It's like,
I would rather someone say, oh, I do see that, and I don't know how to talk about that or what to say about that, because that's real. Then it's like, I can work with that.
Well, you wrote something in the book. I just was like trying to think of ways to get to this. You said, fashion new narratives that are inclusive and reflective of our past and offer new possibilities by expressing and acknowledging the complexity of our stories and the meanings we attach to them. And I was like, well, if we're going to kind of sum up this part of the conversation, I think it's that, right? If we're able to say to folks like, I'm willing to do that, let's do that. Let's acknowledge this and then move on. Like, know that there's meaning attached to who you are and where you come from, more from those that are oppressed than those that haven't necessarily been. And we can move on from that. We don't have to flame it up. And we say, okay, now we understand each other. What do we do next? What's the next move here? And I think that can be powerful.
Yes. And I just want to underscore that before we can move on, that's a lot of work we have to do.
Yeah.
I just want to be really clear, because often I find
we got it. We did it already.
Kumbaya, and so we're not getting to kumbaya in any real way until we've spent some time doing all that work. To fashion those new narratives. Yes.
So what, like, if we go back to public lands, national parks, those type of spaces being this great equalizer, we often talk about them being when people ask, like, why are you an advocate for public lands? I go, well, I have a son and I want my son to understand this type of freedom, to understand this is an American ideal. It's something that we've built that many, many nations around the world just do not have. So it's unique to this country. Then you flip that on your head and be like, okay, that's available to African Americans of all shapes and sizes. They can go there. They can experience it in just the way that I might go there. Why aren't they? I think it was 7% of folks that visit national parks are African American. And so we should just be explicit and say, like, why in the modern sense aren't they there? I guess I could make assumptions like it's economic, but what, can you kind of encapsulate that for people?
And I want to be clear, of course, I'm not speaking for all African Americans, and that's not what I'm doing.
I'm just a
here,
white guy with a podcast too, so
Yeah.
that's the best I can do.
Right. So I want to say that so about maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, I get emails sometimes from people I've never met, which is great. And it was a man who identified himself, that he was white, that he worked in public lands as a manager for public lands, and he had come across my book, and so he was reading it. And the email was incredibly respectful. He was having some trouble. He was challenged by some of the ideas, and he was trying to grapple with it. And one of the things he said was basically what you just said, which was so funny, because he said, in his mind, he didn't understand. Isn't it just choice if you want to come to the public lands? He goes, it's for me, anybody can come that wants to. It's not anything. And I said, boy, so what he really doesn't get is how systemic racism works. And systemic racism is racism. And I'm saying racism. I said it. That was too many times. But embedded.
How dare you?
Yeah, that's right. It's embedded. Those prejudices are embedded in the way things are set up. I have stories. So there's a story that I can tell so many stories, and if people can kind of see what I look like, if you look up and see my picture, and I'm fairly sort of light skinned, medium skinned, light skinned. I have my whole life been stopped by complete strangers on the sidewalks who would just swear that I must be mixed and asking me where I'm from, especially with my hair. I mean, I've dealt with it my whole life, getting challenged about, what I look like from white people. Let me be really clear about that. Black people never do that to me. And, friendly or not, it's kind of invasive, right? To be challenged about, well, who are you or where are you from? I lived in the late 90s. I lived in Seattle, loved Seattle, right? And, talk about beautiful outdoors with Mount Rainier and Baker. And it was like a middle of the week. I was walking home. I had a temp job there for a month, and with a whole lot of other people at 5:00 walking along the street. And I was taking the bus back to where I lived there in Seattle. And I didn't see where I was going. And there was a pothole on the street, and I stepped in it. Now, I had never fractured a bone or anything before until that moment. But, when you step, it's like you hear something. And then the next thing you know, your whole body, you're going to black out, the nausea, all of it. Well, this was pre-cell phone days, right? And I wanted to call my boyfriend at the time to come get me, but I have to find a payphone, and I can barely walk, and I just think I'm going to pass out. So I'm really nervous. I'm going to pass out in the middle of the street with my bag, and I make it over to the curb, and I look up, and there's what looks like a young white family. There's a man and a woman, 2 small kids. And I look up. Now, remember, I'm dressed like I've been in an office all day coming from work. I look up at them, and I'm starting to cry because I'm so scared I'm going to pass out. And I said, can you help me, please? I just, I was trying to explain what happened. And they moved away from me. Not a single person who passed me on the street would help me. Not a single person. I made it to the payphone. Boyfriend came and got me. I just sat on the curb there. Not a single person. Now, we can make 100 excuses why they didn't. But when you say, I looked like everybody else. I was dressed respectfully. I was clean, all the things, right? I didn't, and not a single person in a city that considers itself incredibly progressive and woke would help me. Right. And I wish I could tell you that's the only story I have, but it's not. But it makes the point of saying, in my mind, systemic, something's embedded in there in a cultural consciousness where nobody, and, I've told that story in Seattle when I've been invited, I go back, and they're devastated because they're devastated about their own, like, what? We didn't have, like, you're so nice and all. And I'm like, I said, but it's really interesting. It doesn't matter. Actually, that's why when you hear stories like Harvard, the Harvard professor, the Black Harvard professor, Henry Louis Gates, when you heard that story a few years ago where he was trying to get into his own house and got arrested because the neighbor called the police.
Yeah.
But when
there's the Dave Chappelle skit where he's like, calls the police and they come to his house like, oh, he broke in here and hung up pictures of his family.
Right. That's it. Right. Right, and it's hysterical, and it is also incredibly sad.
Yeah, I
and
know.
incredibly true. Right, that's what makes it so poignant, because it's like, oh my God, I mean, there's choices I've made in places, and I'm an older woman, like it's crazy, but I have to think twice about it, because I just don't want for there to be any misinterpretation.
Well, there's like Jonathan Hall. I'll probably butcher this. I pull it up and read it just from. He was talking about like white people taking justice seriously, which even in itself is like gives me the like I don't know if I'm comfortable with that phrase, but beyond that, he says if until that day comes, until we're able to wrestle with all that we've talked about here, he said I'm going to avoid public lands, wear double blaze orange or wear more orange, and drive below the speed limit when my firearm is in the car.
Yes.
I'm like, here's a real smart, articulate fella that is feeling this way, man, and that sucks. And I gotta figure that out. As much as I want to be like, hey, man, don't put this justice thing on me. I gotta figure out why he's feeling that way if I want to fix it or help fix it.
And then I would say that the justice thing is on all of us.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, justice. So there's a quote that I always use from Cornel West that says, "Justice is love made public."
Yep.
That we don't talk about, but what we're really saying for me is, do I love you enough as a fellow human being to do what I need to do so that you can show up as your whole self and be who you want to be? That's really what it is. People get hung up a lot of time on the idea of justice is always about fight and revolution and all of that. And sometimes that's what has to happen. Historically, we know that. But at its most fundamental sense, it's the ability to, if I was walking down the streets of Seattle and I step into a pothole and hurt myself, there should have been at least 5 or 10 people who were walking past me coming to help me.
Yeah.
That's what justice is.
Like in my own head, I'm like, I would serve you that justice, because anybody that I saw on the street, I would run over there and I would help them. And I don't understand why someone wouldn't. But it's important that I try to understand why someone wouldn't.
Yes.
And this is one of the aspects of it.
I do.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I'm saying. It's like, I understand what that is. The other, there's a sense of, when I was spending all those years backpacking, I looked in my mind like most other backpackers in terms of how I dressed, right? I had my Lonely Planet guides. I had, the khaki pants with the long skirt and the t-shirt. And, I was, my hair was different than it is now, but it was just, I looked like a young woman backpacking around the world, except that I was African American, and I almost never saw anybody who looked like me, which meant that when other people saw me backpacking, they also never saw anybody who looked like me. And it didn't matter that I had I was giving off all the right cues in terms of how I was dressed with my Lonely Planet, with my Osprey backpack. I had all the stuff, all the paraphernalia. And I have to tell you, the people who were always most surprised by my presence abroad were other Americans. And other Americans who would come up to me and say, where are you from? Are you from Israel? I got Israel, Brazil, New Zealand. And I think I'm incredibly American, incredibly New York, So and I'd be looking at the dude and going, dude, I'm from New York. Like, how can you not? You're talking to me for a few minutes. And it would be so surprising to them to find me there, and it wouldn't be, it's not that it was offensive. It's not always about it being offensive or rude. Though I do have a story of an older white man who was very well dressed in his outdoor sports gear in Kathmandu. And we were in a travel agency, and he started talking to me, like, what was I doing there? And I'm telling him everything I was doing. Finally, he looked at me and said, can I take a picture of you? Because I want to show my wife that you are actually here. And I'm a very friendly person, but because I realized I'd just been exoticized. Like in his eyes, I was just unusual. Like and I looked at him and I said, 5 rupees. And he thought I was joking. I said, no, if you pay me 5 rupees, you can take my photo. And he didn't, and he walked away. But I was because I was like, oh my God, that's so, I'm just another human being that happens to be African American doing what you're doing here, traveling through the country.
Yeah.
Don't put that on me. Like, your surprise and all that, it's not my job to explain myself in that way, as I wouldn't expect you to do it. Not in that way. So that's a lot of the again, the question of justice, beyond where you vote or how you show up on protests or not. People, that's one way, right, to show justice. But some of it is just in the straightforward everyday of, when I say, who do we stand with and how do we stand with that person? What does it mean we're willing to risk? Because it may be at your job. It may be when you're out hunting with your buds, whatever it is. And something like this comes up. Who's willing to say something and who isn't? And I can't tell you, some of the best people are unwilling to say anything because it makes them uncomfortable. And it means now they'll be potentially risking that friendship. They'll be potentially risking their job. They'll be potentially risking how others perceive them because they actually said something about it.
Yeah.
And that is a very human reaction. And that's really, at the bare minimum, is asking people to say, wow, how different it would be when, we watch the movies and we see people do it in the movies and we all love it. We're like, oh, yes, they helped that person. We love that. But sometimes that stuff is hard to do in real life when you're faced with it.
Yeah, and I think I've experienced some things around, just talking about black hunters. And we had a show, I got a friend by the name of Charles Rodney, and he lives in Maryland, and he's a big-time rabbit hunter. He's African American.
Yeah.
And he happened to, and I love this man. I love what he stands for. I love his family. His wife is awesome. His kids are awesome. And when he comes on the show, he's incredibly energetic, and I find myself like trying to not generalize his motivations, trying to not tokenize the guy, because I respect him and I love him.
Yes.
I think he's awesome. And I'm trying not to, I don't want to have him on because he's black, and I don't want other people to be interested in talking to him because of that. It's certainly part of who he is, and he grew up in the segregationist South in Louisiana, the child of a sharecropper. And he's able to talk about like the difference in hunting as a pursuit. If you were rich and you were a landowner, you did a certain type of hunting. And if you were poor and you were a sharecropper, you did a certain type of hunting. And that's kind of why he loves to hunt rabbits to this day.
Yeah.
So he has taught me all these things. But I think one of my greatest challenges in knowing him and having this platform where I can have him on and we can talk in public is I just don't want to do that to the guy.
Ben, I would say that in part, that's in part, it's up to him, right? And I think there's something about the transparency. I mean, I hear you saying you don't want to do that to him. I get it. You don't want to tokenize him. You don't want to tokenize anybody. And part of what makes his story so vibrant is the fact that he's African American and had these experiences.
Yeah.
So don't deny him that either. There's a way that, don't be afraid to say, hey, I don't want to tokenize you, and I want you on in part because you are black and you can talk about things I can't talk about in a way, that I can't talk about. And I want people to hear that, along with all the ways you just show up as a whole person in the world. I think that's okay. If I was doing the thing on, I used to have this class where a piece of the class was on Japanese internment. And and I spent time in Japan, and just having that conversation around Japanese internment is just, for me, really, I'm not Japanese, but just the things I feel as an American about what that means in terms of what was done to Japanese people. And I would have this Japanese man who had spent time in a camp come in and tell the story. And I was having him in, and he knew. I said, he's a wonderful human being. And I said, I want you here because you're Japanese and you spent time in the camps. And only you can tell that story in that way. I can't do it. I can speak of it, and around it, but I can't do it in the way. And he was like, oh yeah, I'm there. I'm down, to do that. And you know what? And if you say that to a person and they don't want to do it for that reason, they can tell you that. They can say, I'm sorry, I don't want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, if you don't want that to be the main way people see you, then don't do it, right? Now, that's a great point.
It's just when you're having a show and telling a story, this could have been, I understand why you have me on. There are so many other aspects of my personality. I was an actor for 11 years, right? I'm from the arts. There's other pieces of my personality we could talk about, but that's not what we're here to talk about. I know that this isn't all of who I am. I know that. And I understand you invited me because I wrote the book. And as an African American, I think about these things personally. And that's cool. I do not feel tokenized on any level. Because I understand it. Because if I did, I would say so.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the fear in that is only that you just want the thing that you want is somebody to feel comfortable, feel like they're in it that I'm in it for the right reasons for them, and that everybody has a similar motivation.
Yes.
And so I think that's all open and good.
Yeah. And sometimes it's hard.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's the thing I want to really emphasize for people is that it's hard to do this stuff, to kind of be with people who are not us, to have these kinds of conversations. And it doesn't mean it can't be open and good and exciting. And sometimes it's hard. That's it.
Yeah, I definitely want to come and see your performance piece about John Muir. It's called The N-Word: Nature Revisited. That sounds fantastic, man. That sounds like I'm just gonna come with a Coors Light and let's get it. Let's go. Let's go. Let's see what's going down.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you tell me just about that? Because I think it illustrates, of course, what we already talked about, which is there's these figures that we idolize, but they're complicated.
So in 2016, and I'm still working on this, but in 2016 was the centennial for the national parks. And so that year, and some of your listeners may remember this, there's lots of celebrations and activities. And my doctorate is in geography. And so there's always a huge geography conference every year. Thousands of people come. And they had a special panel. They asked about 7 or 8 of us geographers, but from different parts of the discipline, to sit on it. And they said, the question that we're going to ask each of you is John Muir still relevant today? Right? And they said, you have 10 to 12 minutes to answer that question. So I had worked on this idea that I didn't want to just come up with some answer. And I started thinking about, is John Muir still relevant? Like, how do I feel about that? Right. And so one of the things I did, I thought about, so your readers and you probably remember the movie and the story Gone with the Wind.
Yep.
Right. Written by Margaret Mitchell. And in the early 2000s, there was a Black writer out of Harvard named Alice Randall who thought, I wonder if Gone with the Wind had been written by a Black woman. It had been, the central character was a Black woman instead of Scarlett O'Hara. How would the story be different? So she wrote it. She wrote a book called The Wind Done Gone. And exactly, right?
That's awesome.
Yes. And the central character was what she described it as a mulatto, the half sister of Scarlett O'Hara. And she wasn't trying to be funny in the story, but the title is pretty funny.
Yeah, it is.
And so I'm telling the audience this, and I'm saying, the Margaret Mitchell estate lost their minds, right? They didn't want this book to be published. So when you try to buy it, on the front, it'll say a parody, because she was forced to put that on the cover, even though that's not what she was trying to do. So I'm telling the audience this, and I'm saying, so I was thinking about one of John Muir's books. One of the ones he wrote was 1,000-Mile Walk Through the Gulf in 1867. And in 1867, he spent, I think, more than a year walking through some southern states like Kentucky. He made it all the way down to Cuba, actually, because he wanted to look at the impact of war on the landscape, right? And so then what I did is I took passages from Muir's book. It was published, I believe, in 1916. In his words, and some beautiful things he was saying about the nature he was seeing. But I also read some passages about some of the things he was saying about the Black people he was seeing, in his words, right? So I'm just reading his words to the audience, and I'm saying that each year, I'd say the date, and I'd say this thing about that he said. And then I looked at the audience and said, so I wondered, what if a Black woman had written this instead, right? So instead of calling it 1,000-Mile Walk Through the Gulf in 1867, I called it 1,000-Mile Walk Was Rough, right? And I made up a character called Sojourner Washington Douglas. And then what I did, I put quotes but I pulled real historical facts, like, that she was born in Louisiana and the hangings that were going on in Colfax there. I talked about how she was ducking and weaving across a hostile landscape. I talked about how she wasn't light enough to pass, so she had to, use the woods in order to make her escape. And then I got to 1890, and I'd go, 1890, Jim Crow was the man. 1900, Jim Crow was the man. 1910, Jim Crow was the man. And I kept doing that, right? And then when I got to 1940, I said, this is when Sojourner Washington Douglas passed away and Jim Crow was still the man. Then the second part of my answer was, there's a book called Rap on Race, and it's an amazing book. It's a transcribed conversation between James Baldwin, the Black poet, and Margaret Mead, the white anthropologist, who's probably one of the most famous anthropologists. And they, who don't agree on a lot of things, have this conversation about race. And so it's incredibly powerful. So I'm telling the audience about that. And then I said, I sit on the National Parks Advisory Board, or at least in 2016 I was. And I said, what would it be like if John Muir and I had a conversation? So then I kind of did a little scene, like I made it kind of funny about inviting him over to my place and how he was looking really surprised to see me there. And I said, did he imagine I'd be cleaning his house? But he's having this conversation with me. And I serve him green tea and I'm trying to kind of enlighten him some stuff. And I make it sort of funny because I bring up like Oprah and Tupac and things he doesn't know anything. And I was like, oh, that's going to be too difficult for him. But let's talk about this. And I just, in the end, say to him, why don't we meet again? But I know you need some time to think about everything I just said to you, because I tell him about Shelton Johnson, the Black Park Ranger in Yosemite. And I'm just telling him things, and then he goes away. And at the end, I look at the audience and say, it's not a question of whether or not he's relevant or not. It's that he becomes relevant on my terms. And there's some things. So I wanted to expand the whole thing into a one-woman show that has imagery that kind of looks at our understandings of nature and conservation and wilderness. And again, how it's been constructed over time in this country and where the issue of race and perspective comes in, right? And to understand the complexity of that, where you could have a man like John Muir who clearly loved the idea of nature and wilderness and committed his life to that, but could also hold racist perspectives about human beings that didn't look like him.
Yeah. And I think it strikes me like you're able to both be a pragmatist about this when you talk about it, and you're also emotionally connected, like astoundingly emotionally connected to it for great reason, right? So you can do both things at the same time. Yes. And I think that's important.
Yes, I think that we all can, and that it just is, what I always tell an audience that I'm talking to, I said, I refuse to give up my humanity in this work. I'm not interested in, any anger that I have, I feel is what it is. It's anger. And sometimes that's what comes up, and emotion, and sadness and all these things come up. And actually, I'm a real optimist I believe in it, our capacity to be so much better than we are, and I'm not interested in becoming suddenly the oppressor. So I don't want to start. I can say that, John Muir had some racist thoughts and ideas embedded in his work. That's real, which doesn't make him necessarily a horrible person, but I can certainly be upset with him about his racism. And I can certainly appreciate his commitment to the wilderness and nature. I can do both.
Yeah, no, that's huge.
Right?
But I think I'd probably be remiss if I didn't ask you the simple question, like, what do you think? You're a New York born, like East Coast. You live in Vermont now. You've been around. You were in Berkeley for a while. What do you think about?
I've been around.
Been around. You've been to Nepal. You've been to Africa. Yes. You've been to Asia. All these places. What do you think about hunting? Like, where's your sensibility lie there?
Yeah. So this is one of my, like I said, I have a dad still, father who was really into guns. Not so much when he was a kid, he did hunting, but, we lived in New York. So my father, well, that's not entirely true. There's a funny story. So on the property we grew up on, there was a proliferation of geese. And like, there's a lot of, just so many geese. And because my father's job, was to keep the lawns and the grounds nice, geese poop everywhere, right? And it made my father crazy. So he'd go out sometimes at midnight and he'd be shooting up the geese on the property. He'd go sit on the roof of one of the house. I mean, it became such a thing. He was in the local paper about how much he hated the geese. He said he would wake up at night from a nightmare. My mother said he would sit up screaming because he said he'd be sitting in his little rowboat on the lake and the geese would suddenly start attacking him, right, in his dream. Right. So it was a long running thing with him and the geese, but that's the only time that I saw him hunt. And it wasn't for sport and it wasn't for food. It was for, I don't know. He wanted to get rid of the geese. Right? Yeah. He just had a thing.
Population control.
Population control. Thank you. That's right. The thing that I feel like I can understand is hunting for food. I can understand that. For a couple of years, I was friends with I was I had a romantic relationship with a German forester, and he hunted. And this is when I lived in Nepal, and I went to Germany. And I remember, your audience is not going to like me after I say this, but this was about 20 years ago, so cut me a little slack. So I was in Germany, and I remember going out with him and another friend of his. They were going to hunt, and it's just hard for me. I couldn't, if we weren't, we didn't need to hunt, so I just didn't understand it. So I remember I couldn't go with him. I said, I'll wait. And I was like praying that they don't get anything. And they didn't, but I was really happy about that. And I enjoyed a huge plate of meat. Let me just say,
Yeah.
They served all this delicious meat that his wife cooked up. And his friend's wife cooked up, and it was amazing. And I ate it, right? So it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
So when I look at it now, and I know people, I've become friends with people like Jonathan Hall, who are hunters. And I also met, oh my God, he's a young white guy who goes around. He used to be an outdoor adventurer, but he's like hardcore hunter now. His name will come back to me because I know you know who he is.
I'm sure I will.
Yeah, and I'm just basing out on his name because he's got an unusual name. And we were both speaking at something this past year, and I met him, and I really listened to his story, which was amazing. And I thought, hey, people, for me, there's something about consciousness. How conscious are we and responsible for what it is that we do? So I can't, the thing here's where I can't go. When the sport hunter who goes to South Africa to hunt elephants for sport so he can put the head on the wall is really hard for me. I don't get it. I love elephants, and I just don't get why you would want to put a wild animal's head on the wall simply for sport, not because you were trying to survive or eat or, whatever it is. I just don't understand that.
Yeah.
But I certainly have respect for people who are consciously trying to engage, like they're going to eat meat, they're going to hunt for that meat. They're going to skin that meat. They're going to think about that population that they live in a relationship with, where they live. That's really, for me, that there's something really deep about that. To take that kind of responsibility and be that involved so that you're walking your talk in a very particular way. And so that I have a lot of respect for. I have a hard time with guns. I have shotguns, I have to say that I was really good at it in terms of target shooting. And this was when I was with the German guy. I said, I'm competitive. So there's an aspect of that in terms of the sport, just shooting the gun, not shooting it at anything beyond a target. But I've never had to shoot anything that was living. And I don't know, but if I had to survive, like if that was the situation and it was a survival, like if I want to eat, the only way I can eat is hunt for it. I'm going to learn how.
I love it, man. Well, that's fairly common, right? That's the way you just articulated all of that is pretty, what I find is most people are kind of in that spot, and they're open to it, but only under certain circumstances, and they're fighting the preconceptions that are out there in their own minds.
That's right.
And that's just where we are.
Yes, and I've loved, it's because I've had significant others who hunt. I have like to think that I have diverse people. I've had diverse people in my lives, and when I've loved people, that have had aspects of their character and personality are very different than my own, I've had to work hard to, walk my own talk about standing in the difference of respecting that, or trying to, at least at the bare minimum, trying to understand it.
Yeah.
Even though I don't have to do exactly what they do in the way that they do it any more than they have to do that for me, right? And what that means. So I can kind of come to it from that way. And I'm always open and learning about what it means to be, what it means to walk our talk around issues of conservation and being in better relationship with non-human nature and kind of showing up there.
Yeah.
How are we real about that?
How are we? Yeah, I've had people label me in certain ways just for speaking about that. I'm like, I don't want to self-profess anything, but I do think that as a hunter nowadays, there's just certain things that are more palatable to most folks. And when you start talking about the food and the connection to nature and worrying about healthy ecosystems and thinking about these animals and in a way of value and that sits in a certain value system, I think people generally accept that and are willing to move towards it. So, it's good to hear that. Obviously, like you said, it wasn't the reason I had you on, but I just wanted to know, just from your experience, what you thought.
Yeah, and I'm looking. It's funny as we're talking because I really want to find the name of that hunter, which I just feel like I know. He, a lot of your listeners probably even know who he is because he was so. I heard his story this year, and he was so amazing. But I don't know that I can find it while we're talking and be focused.
we'll have to dig it up.
Yes.
I can think of a lot of names. I could rattle off a bunch of them, but I don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think kind of just to start to try to wrap this up. I mean, I wonder, and I'm going to sit and think about kind of what you've said here and some of the ways to move forward and kind of the perspective that's within your work and then this conversation even in and of itself, because I think it requires some introspection on all our parts, on my part and everyone listening. Do you feel that we're headed in the right direction with this stuff, and are there examples of things that folks can do, whether it's tangible or intangible, to kind of show that they're in the right mindset here?
So I will say this, we are moving forward, right? Sorry. Mating.
Oh, Mating Putelis?
Yes.
Yeah. His brother is sitting across the room from me right now.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So, it was Mating's story because we met and we were both talking at a thing together, and his story was so amazing, and just the way he told it was amazing.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really helpful for me. So
we love Mating. His brother Giannis is a big part of our company and on our show.
Oh, okay.
He's been on this show many times.
Okay. So
That's awesome.
I can move on.
Now we can move on and talk.
Yeah.
Shout out to Mating. He's a great representative for all of us, man. We love that guy.
Yes. Yes. Whether or not we're moving in the right direction, I think that the fact that we're moving forward is the right thing to do. I mean, and the thing that's true, I will say to you and your listeners, is that 15 years ago, my phone wouldn't have been ringing around. I only go places where I'm invited, right? And I only around to have these conversations because I can't force anybody to do anything and I don't want to. And if people, this is how I make a living. And also I have to be invited in. And I have, in the last 5 years since the book has come out, I haven't had to look for work. I'm overextended. I'm so overextended already in the next year. So what I'm saying about that is that feels exciting because most of those invitations are from predominantly white groups who are trying to think about how do we do this? A lot of the things you said today. How do we understand this? What is required of us? And so forth. And so that's just beyond exciting for me because that's where growth happens for all of us. What does it mean for us to be willing and ready to sort of show up, not just for the conversation, but to sort of, put our hands together and our heads together and our hearts together and move forward, right? So I'm really excited by that. What was the second thing, Ben? You said the second part of that question?
What are there tangible or intangible things that people can do? I think probably more tangible here because a lot of what we're talking about is just conceptual, how we think about things. But is there, other than I think would probably be obvious, like find someone in your community that doesn't look like you and talk to them about these ideas. Is there other things like larger, since you kind of have seen how our government works and how legislation works? Is there larger things that can be done?
Yes, and there's a very easy an article that if people have access to online, they can get to. So last December, I was part of a group, REI sponsored a group of us to come together in New York City for the Atlantic magazine to have a conversation, a taped conversation about this. And so the article is called 5 Ways to Make the Outdoors More Inclusive. And, there were Atlanta writers there, and they put it all together and came up with a bunch of steps and sort of one-on-one fundamental ways, different ways people could be thinking about how they might move forward. And they had the range of us in the room it was just a range. There was maybe about 8 of us in the room, including his voice was in the room, Ken Salazar, who had been one of the Secretary of the Interior. But then they had just people from different parts of the country who do this work. And some of what they were saying, I've got the article open here, what we were saying, I'm sorry. and has the pictures of who everybody is so people can get a sense of that. It's everything from in terms of what are the backstories of the outdoor spaces that you live in, and we were saying here, hire historians. What I would say at the most fundamental level is kind of doing your own discovery. What stories are you not hearing? It's so interesting about a piece of land, a piece of wilderness, a piece of forest. We just sort of accept, what we've been told, but what else is there? And then when we know that, how does that change the way we think about that space, and who shows up in that space and who doesn't? What does it mean to lobby local, state, and federal governments to create storytelling-driven memorials? So one of the things for me is that the great thing about land, and public land in particular, and forests, when we think about all the tensions around our differences and how it seems like today we're just not getting along with each other and everybody's talking about us and them and this divide. And I would say, well, that stuff has always been there. It's just surfaced. And it's actually an opportunity. What better place to set up some kind of these conversations or a way to tell these stories differently than our public lands? There's, it's like the obvious, right? Because land in and of itself, and I don't mean to sound woo-woo with this, is healing. We all need it. We're all here on it. How do we use those spaces in our communities to, if you take a group of people on a walk through the woods, what can we open up in terms of what stories are there, in terms of everybody bringing their story into the woods with them? Let's have that conversation, and you can have them in the woods, right? I think that's something everybody can do. I mean, of course, there's, I'm looking at, we had so many things written down here. Be flexible with rules to make visitors feel comfortable. They were talking very particularly about public lands. And I would say in terms of hunting groups and the way people go out, and go hunting. I know some rules need to be there for people's safety. And there's also, sometimes it's just interesting in terms of how things are done. People will fall back on, well, this is how we've always done it. So that's why we're going to continue doing it this way. But we're saying we want more diverse people to come join us. So I'm going to say, if you always do things in the same way, how can you expect something different? It's kind of basic. So to really sort of re-examine some of the cultural practices around how you organize when you go on hunting trips and where you choose to go and what is it you know about that place before you go there and what you don't know, and what does it mean to actually, if you're really saying we would love to have different people involved and know different people, what does an invitation look like? And what does an invitation look like that isn't simply tokenizing that person? And what would it look like not to invite just one person who is different? Like if you're going to invite, let's say, an African American, don't just invite one to come along and be in the group. That's a hard place. I've been in that place. It's really, there's a lot of pressure. You know what I mean? You may want to, get a cohort. Like, what does it mean to, before that, have some conversations with, people in the community about that and and organize that trip together. So it's not one person making a decision for everyone else. So even in how hunting trips and gatherings are organized, what would it look like to, and I'm not saying you are not already doing this or your listeners aren't already doing this, but once you've hunted, you've caught some animals, to have, so it may be, the skinning part and preparing the meat may be a little hard for people who haven't done that before. But what does it look like to have a meal where and people are invited to come share with what you have? So we want to invite you in for this and have that open up as an opportunity. And ultimately, what does it mean, in terms of all of us having our freedom and agency to choose the things we want to do? At the end of the day, some of those people may not want to still join you on the hunting trip, but they may want to be in relationship with you and support you so you can do what it is you want to do, right? So to understand that, I would say that the intention doesn't have to be to get more people hunting. The intention can be bigger than that. To be, how do we are in support of each other and be part of this community? So it may mean that you will get some new hunters with you, and you might not get some other people hunting with you. But that doesn't mean that they won't be happy to come and help you cook up the food or just be part of your community in a fuller way and so when you come to them and there's something that has to be voted on that's going to support those public lands so that you all can continue to hunt, we know it's the numbers, my friends, right?
Yes.
Who's going to be voting that? And someone like myself, who's not thinking one way or the other about it, who might overlook that vote just because I'm not thinking about that. It's not part of my life. The difference is if I'm in relationship with you and I know who you are and say, well, you know what? This doesn't really matter to me, but it matters to my friend Ben. So I'm actually going to learn more about it and I'm going to vote in favor to support it for him.
Yeah. And that's like a great way to put it. And also for me, just thinking from reading your book and reading Jonathan Hall's article, and Hall is a little bit more direct about it than anybody, but like just saying like, hey man, if you're thinking about this and you're looking for that cultural competency and you're thinking about these topics, you're already winning that battle a little bit.
Yes.
Because when you run into a guy that doesn't look like you or a young lady that doesn't look like you and she's interested, you'll already be like, oh yeah, you know what I could do to help this person out if there is some barriers that I'm not seeing, is a little bit understanding of like where we're going, what this place is, what it used to be, what they might be thinking, and that's worthwhile in any endeavor, let alone hunting. It's like it's just empathy, really.
Yes, and that we always are re-examining of one's own assumption.
Yes.
The assumptions that we have about someone else, what we think they don't know, what they think they won't like, what we think they're experiencing, and how we can be really wrong about that and be pleasantly surprised, actually, to find out that, oh, they had that, they had a family member who hunted, and actually they grew up with, just the things that come out that we don't know about someone. Until we take the time to get to know them, right, and make space for that.
Well, I'm definitely going to do that. And thanks really for not only your work, but just being open to come on and talk about this. Like I said, we're not going to just sit here and pat myself on the back for being willing to have this conversation the whole time. But like, there's a level of, just courage it takes to step out and talk about this stuff and hit it head on, and attack it because we can agree. The one thing everyone listening here can agree on is 2% of hunters being African American is not enough. Hopefully we can all agree on that. I certainly think we can. So if we start from there, any of this conversation is good.
Yes, and that, again, even if you don't get as many people as you would like hunting, to get people to support those of you who do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's, that has value, right? And Ben, thank you. Look, thank you for having me on the show. Thank you for your willingness to make space for this conversation. For me, that's a huge part of it. It's just, I almost never say no to anyone because that's really why I'm so overextended, because I'm always excited. I was like, oh, this is so cool. I love it because it challenges me to think more broadly. It challenges me to sort of re-examine my own assumptions. And there's so much potential there for where we might go. So thank you for making the space and the time for me. This was fun.
Well, you can check out Black Faces, White Spaces, or you can go to your website, and I did all that and just read as much as I could, and just get out there and be curious about this stuff, everybody. And it's never going to hurt anything. Open your mind a little bit to it and see where it goes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Okay, thanks, Ben.
I guess I grew up on an older road.
That's it. That's all. Another episode in the books. Thank you to Miles Nolte. Thank you to Carolyn Finney. Thank you to all of you for sticking with us through this ride and through this topic. I don't want to overstate how fraught it is and keep saying that, but it's just something I haven't heard discussed, and I wanted to make sure that we did. So I think it was done wonderfully by Carolyn, and so thanks her so much for spending the time with us, and we can hope to have her on and folks like Jonathan Hall on later in the podcast. So before we go, here's what I'll say. I'm going to just rip a freestyle here. Phil, it's Thanksgiving, man. Like, that's coming up in a couple of days, and there's a lot to be thankful for, but I will be super corny in saying that I'm thankful for my family, my wife, my son, the support of a company like Mediator to let us put this on and let us get silly, get serious, go all over the place, come up with names for mustaches, and drink sparkly beverages and make jokes. That all, while it might seem inane, it's important to me that we can do this, and it's important to me that you all listen. So thank you for doing that, and thank you to everyone that supports this show and helps us put it on. Right, Phil? You want to give some thank yous out there?
Yeah, same thing as you. Family, I'm thankful for. We made a joke in the opening about how I felt unwelcome here because I'm a non-hunter.
That's right.
But that couldn't be further from the truth. I've had many people being like, "Hey, let's bring you out on your first hunt," and even though I don't know what I'm talking about, it's been really inclusive, and I'm thankful to be a part of it, and for you for just randomly. I think one of my first days here, you started talking to me, and I wasn't expecting it.
Yeah.
On your podcast, it was with Miles actually. You were talking about beached whales or something like that.
Oh yeah.
And I made a fool out of myself, but then you kept talking to me, and now my mustache has a name.
Yeah.
And everyone knows who Mango is.
Yeah, it's you
thank
never
you.
You never know where. Well, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. You never know where things are going to go, but we do just want everybody to know that we work hard at this. We want to get better. We take all the praise and all of the criticism in the same manner, and we're going to keep on going here at the Hunting Collective. And next episode is episode 90. That's a lot. So we're very thankful. Enjoy the holidays with your family. Have fun. Be merry. Eat turkey. Take naps. See ya.
Stay here too long, 'cause I can't go a week without doing wrong. Oh, without doing wrong. Drinking without doing wrong. Oh, without doing wrong. Drinking in heaven. So I'm sitting as the bar stool starts to grow roots. I'm feeling like an old worn out pair of shoes. Oh, tell me what is it that I should do?
Hey everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. Meat Eater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the engineer is going to be there. Meat Eater Live headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay? Every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Art Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.